You've heard us talk about hormone therapy by Happy Mammoth many times by now. It's a supplement that helps women maintain optimal hormone levels with over 50,000 glowing reviews from women all over the globe. 98% say that they would recommend it to friends and family. And that's why we're recommending it to you. Now we can take those hormone harmony results even further by pairing it with Happy Mammoth's probiotic collagen protein. It helps restore gut lining integrity, promoting overall hormone balance. It also helps relieve occasional bloating, reduce sugar cravings, and helps you feel satisfied longer. Because your gut directly affects your hormones, improving gut health can amplify your hormone harmony results so you feel like yourself again. Happy Mammoth is dedicated to making women's lives easier, and that means using only science-backed ingredients that have been proven to work for women. They make no compromise when it comes to quality, and it shows. Right now, you can try prebiotic collagen protein and hormone harmony risk-free and get 15% off your entire order with code MurderDiaries at checkout. That's happymammoth.com and use code MurderDiaries for 15% off today.
Optimism isn't sunshine and rainbows. It's fixing things, changing the way we fix things. It's running the world on smarter energy. Because if optimism never stops, then change can't either. GE Vernova, the energy of change.
Hey friends, this is Audie Cornish, host of CNN This Morning and The Assignment, and guess what? Every story you care about, every angle you want unpacked is now streaming on CNN. That means you can catch my show or other CNN programming whenever you want on your favorite device. And a subscription also gets you access to exclusive video series and unlimited articles. So subscribe to CNN at cnn.com/subscription.
Welcome to the Murder Diaries. I'm Natalie.
And I'm Paige. Make sure if you want to listen ad-free that you head over to patreon.com/themurderdiariespod or search The Murder Diaries ad-free on Spotify. Also, please make sure to leave us a positive review on Apple and subscribe on YouTube and all of our socials. It really helps us keep The Murder Diaries going. Reminder, The Murder Diaries is going to have its own feed again soon because we are moving unscripted to its very own feed come January. So stay tuned.
No matter what your home life looks like, one thing's usually true. Family can be complicated. For John J.C. McGhee, it was more like a tangled bowl of spaghetti, layers of connection, history, and a little extra sauce. He was one of 9 siblings himself. And as he grew older, he became a father to several children with different women, some possibly during his teenage years, according to his daughter Madison. And even now, the full picture of John's family tree is a bit of a mystery. Madison knows she's one of 6 confirmed siblings, but there are whispers of more. It's a lot to sort through, but that's family, complicated, imperfect, and deeply human. To make things even more complicated, John, who we'll refer to as JC moving forward, once served as a confidential informant and ended up testifying against his own cousin. The case involved drug trafficking and was prosecuted under the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, better known as RICO. And in a twist that feels almost too on the nose, the cousin JC testified against was actually named Rico. It might sound like something out of a crime drama, but for JC and his family, it was anything but fiction. It was real, messy, and marked the beginning of a deeper and more complex relationship between JC and law enforcement, one that extended far beyond this single case. Then one night, everything changed. JC was suddenly and violently killed during what appeared to be a home invasion, leaving him lifeless on the floor of his own living room. His death wasn't only tragic, but shrouded in questions that have haunted his loved ones ever since. Was it a random robbery gone terribly wrong? Could it have been connected to whispers about his role as a confidential informant, what some would label a snitch? Or was it tied to the child custody hearing he was scheduled to attend the very next morning? So many questions still linger after all of these years. JC lived a complicated life. He faced personal struggles, battled addiction, and had more than a few brushes with the law. His relationships were often turbulent, and his path wasn't always an easy one. But those who knew him best also saw a man who cared deeply. He was a father who loved his children and had a big heart for the people in his life. What happened to him in the early morning hours of July 11th, 2002 remains a painful mystery. And the question that continues to echo, will justice ever be served? This is his story.
Used to think it's in my head, but I'm walking with the dead.
JC was born John McGhee on May 4th, 1957 in Wheeling, West Virginia. His parents were Charles Green McGhee and Daisy Womack McGhee. And John, as I mentioned earlier, was one of 9 children. As an adult, JC had many children of his own, a total of 6 from different women. There's Kathy, Joel, Yolanda, Alyssa, Madison, and Shane. Now, his daughter Madison, who's a friend of ours here at the Murder Diaries, and you may recognize her name from an interview she did with us over the summer. She describes her dad as funny and musical. She has fond memories as a child listening to Nelly's Hot in Here album in the car with JC, and the two of them singing along. JC and Madison's mother were never married and were separated when JC died, but Madison remembers them being friendly. JC would even help Madison's mother from time to time if she was struggling with money or her drug dependency. And while Madison acknowledges that she was passed back and forth between JC and her mom and was raised mostly by her grandmother, her childhood was a lot happier than it might have looked on paper. For the most part, she was a happy kid. Some of JC's other children weren't so lucky. His youngest child, Shane, was born addicted to the heroin that his mother, Deneen, had relapsed on during pregnancy. Deneen Schrader was a sex worker that JC had been involved with prior to Shane's birth. It's unclear if they were dating, and there's even some uncertainty as to whether or not JC was actually Shane's father. At some point during the pregnancy, Deneen decided that she didn't want to keep the baby, so she went to a house for pregnant women in Philadelphia called Madame Marie's, a place where the Marie in question would arrange illegal adoptions at the price of $20,000. The money would be split between Marie, the pregnant mother, and the doctor and lawyer who helped out in the process, and even $5,000 apiece. So a deal was made. A couple had been lined up to illegally adopt Deneen's baby, and the money had been paid. But at the last minute, Deneen had a change of heart, decided not to go through with the planned adoption, and took her yet-to-be-born baby, as well as the cashed $5,000 check Madame Marie had given her, and headed back to Ohio. What could Madame Marie or anyone else have done? They certainly weren't going to call the police. Nobody was taking Deneen to small claims court. It was an illegal adoption racket. Buyer beware, as the saying goes. When Shane was born, a custody battle began between JC and Deneen. And despite the fact that baby Shane was born sick on the heroin that Deneen used while she was pregnant, she was temporarily allowed to keep him. A final court hearing scheduled on July 12, 2002, would decide who Shane ultimately ended up with. It was important to Deneen that she retain custody of Shane, because if the state returned him over to JC, she would lose the valuable Social Security checks she received because of Shane's disabilities that were caused by the heroin. And despite all of this messiness, and as a great example of what kind of man JC could be, he let Deneen stay on his property and even helped care for the child.
But trouble always seemed to be following JC. In the 1990s, he had owned a bar called Johnny Cool's in Wheeling. His daughter Madison described it as having a, quote, typical 90s vibe and a fun place to be. But the bar also attracted a darker element. Sex workers and illegal drugs were regular staples of Johnny Cool's. Eventually, the place was shut down by the police, and JC was singled out as a guilty by association perpetrator of these illegal activities. Authorities offered JC a deal that stipulated if he told them who was trafficking drugs through Johnny Cool's, they would release him from jail and he would be cleared of all charges. So, JC took the deal and would eventually testify in court against 75 people on the indictment. One of these people happened to be his cousin, Rico.
Because of JC's testimony, Rico wound up with a life sentence in prison with no possibility of parole. And the success of this RICO Act sting made the police recognize a value in JC as a confidential informant. He would become their own personal snitch for all kinds of other illegal activities. And the pay was good. But the word was out in the community about JC. Nobody could trust him anymore. Yet there was nothing he could do about it. At the time he agreed to work with the police, he had full custody of his other daughter, Alyssa. If he stopped cooperating, JC would go to prison and Alyssa would wind up being churned through the foster care system. So his back was against the wall. The confidential informant work caused other fallout within the family. Madison said a lot of trust was lost between JC and various family members. She says that he struggled with the morals of the situation he was in. My dad struggled with a lot of depression and anxiety, and I think the moral struggle, if he hadn't been murdered, I think that would have killed him instead, Madison said. And that brings us to the way that JC actually did die. In the early morning hours of July 11th, 2002, 16-year-old Alyssa McGhee called 911. She told the operator that her father, JC McGhee, had been shot in the living room of their home. At the time of the call, JC was lying on the floor unresponsive, and Alyssa couldn't be sure whether or not he was breathing. She told the dispatcher that she'd heard a loud pop sound, then she heard her father scream, and then the sound of something hitting the floor. When she rushed to the living room, she found her father dying on the floor, bleeding heavily. The dispatcher asked Alyssa if she wanted to perform CPR on JC, but she said she was too scared. There was too much blood on and around her father, and she was sure it was coming from his head. The dispatcher then asked Alyssa if she could see a gun near JC's body, and Alyssa said that while her father kept several guns in the house, she didn't see one in the living room. And as this nightmare was unfolding in the McGhee home, neither JC, Alyssa, nor the 911 dispatch operator could have known about another nightmare that had been happening for the last hour in the house right next door. JC's neighbors were his sister, Pearl Foston, and Pearl's son, JC's nephew, Omar Foston. A little more than an hour before the shooting at JC's house, 3 men armed with guns barged into the Foston residence and began wreaking havoc. Omar's girlfriend, Kim Smith, was present that morning, and she later told police that she and Omar had been babysitting over in St. Clairsville until 4 a.m. when they returned to Pearl and Omar's home. Kim lay down on the couch with her dog, and Omar sat on the floor, and the two of them watched a rerun of Matlock on the TV. Kim's dog became spooked by something outside and began barking. Shortly after that, they heard a loud bang outside. And suddenly men with guns were entering the Foston residence through the front of the home, aiming their guns at Omar. They were young black males, one wearing a hooded sweatshirt and another in a St. Louis Cardinals jacket. Kim was ordered to get down on the ground, and they restrained her with a telephone cord. According to Kim, the men were yelling things like, "Where's the money?" and "We came all this way, we're the West Side Task Force." Pearl had been asleep in bed when she awoke, startled by the sound of a thump. Omar was standing at her bedside with 2 of the men, one who wore a hoodie with the top over his head, aiming a shotgun at Omar's back, and another who was aiming a gun at Pearl. Pearl was ordered out of bed, and one of the men asked if she had any money. Pearl gave him her purse, but when the man was unsatisfied with what he'd found inside, he said, "That's not enough," and then asked if she had a safe. She said she did, but there was no money inside. This was proven to be true when the safe was opened and inspected. Omar and Pearl were ordered to return to the living room, where Pearl was kicked to the ground next to Kim and restrained with the telephone cord. Pearl and Kim were repeatedly kicked and called names. And at one point, one of the men said, "Burn them." Sheets were pulled over them and someone poured alcohol onto the sheets, drenching Pearl and Kim beneath. The men also threatened to cut off fingers and toes. Kim didn't think the men were locals because they were using an unfamiliar kind of slang. They continued talking about money, saying things like, "We ain't got no money yet," and "We're taking too long in here." Kim also said she heard someone's voice on a radio or a walkie-talkie, which made her think that there might have been a fourth assailant, possibly outside on lookout duty.
Omar was eventually tied up as well, and a pillowcase was pulled over his head. The men asked Omar where he worked, and he said he didn't work. He went to college. They accused him of lying to them and kicked him repeatedly. At one point, Omar was taken outside and made to get down on his knees. Then he was brought back into the house, at which point one of the assailants kicked him in the face and instructed him to lie down.
Pearl later told police that Omar hadn't taken his medication and was, quote, running off his mouth and being smart. She could hear the men beating him and threatening to kill him. She said the men kept demanding drugs and money, and when she cried out asking who they were, one of the men repeated something similar to what another had told Kim, that they were, quote, the Midwest Task Force. At one point, one of their assailants asked Omar who lived next door, and Omar told them that it was J.C. McGhee, and he told them that J.C. had money. According to Omar, the men then took him to J.C.'s house, and as they began to break down the front door, Omar yelled out, "Uncle J.C., help! They're gonna kill me!" According to Omar, as the men entered J.C.'s home, J.C. yelled at them, "I got my child in here." And as J.C. reached to get his gun from the closet, the assailants gunned him down. Omar was able to escape, running past a black van with a white stripe on the side, parked in the driveway. As he ran past the van, someone fired shots at him, but they missed. And Omar was able to run up the road to the Wheeling Brake and Block manufacturing plant, and it was there that he called the police. Omar told the dispatcher that his house was being robbed, saying, "They got my mom and my girl." When asked by the dispatcher if he knew his attackers, Omar said yes, and then something about someone being from California. He told the 911 operator about the black van and that it had Ohio plates. Back at the house, Kim worked to remove her restraints, and at one point heard gunfire outside. When she freed herself, she raced into the kitchen and hit a panic button that had been installed there to alert authorities in the event of an emergency or trouble. Eventually, authorities arrived and went to both the Foston and McGhee residences. Kim still had phone cord tied around her wrist and a large bump on her head where she'd been hit by the butt of a gun. Omar arrived back to the house after a while, ranting and raving about how he was going to get revenge on the men who had done this. Police also witnessed injuries on his head and hands. The police had quite a few questions for Omar. First, they told him that his story didn't make any sense. Why would men show up at his house and demand money and drugs that they knew he didn't have? How would they have known his mom Pearl lived there as well? And why would they leave Omar's house to go next door and kill someone who had nothing to do with anything going on with Omar? Omar didn't have answers for these questions. He just kept denying he knew the men. When the police pressed him, Omar finally said that someone named Dwight McGhee had ripped them off for $2,000 and that they'd come to town to get some of that money back. Back in the McGhee home, by the time the police arrived at JC's side in his living room, he was already dead. He had been shot once in the head, and his head and face were drenched in blood. There was blood spatter on his torso, as well as on the walls nearest his body. They found a badly damaged bullet lodged into the wall behind the front door. They also observed that the door frame trim and deadbolt had been broken loose and that there were kick marks on the door. When asked by the police if anyone else was in the home, Alyssa said that she thought the killers were still there, but upon inspection, there was no one else present. JC's daughter, Madison, later said that during the robbery, Omar may have mentioned that there was a safe in JC's home. But the question we have is, if the assailants really had been looking for a safe when they entered the house, why did they just shoot him and leave him without doing any kind of search? They didn't even take the chain necklace from around his neck. Madison is also surprised at how deadly accurate the shot was that killed her father, especially during something as volatile and erratic as a home invasion. During the 911 call that Alyssa McGhee made the morning of the shooting, the dispatcher asked her if she knew who might have shot and killed her father. Alyssa said that JC had been trying to get custody of his son from the boy's mother. And according to Alyssa, JC and Deneen had a problematic past, but things had been okay between them recently. As far as Alyssa knew, JC hadn't had any problems with anyone else.
Once all the victims had been removed from the Foston and McGhee homes and the perimeters had been secured, police began to search the houses. The Foston home had been ransacked top to bottom, and it reeked of rubbing alcohol. Ripped phone wire was found on a chair and on the floor, and 3 cannabis plants were found on the driveway. A black flashlight was also removed from JC's front yard.
Starting this podcast felt like juggling 10 jobs with no training. If Paige and I had Shopify back then, we could have skipped half the chaos. It's the all-in-one tool that helps you run, grow, and actually enjoy your business. No MBA required. The thing I love about Shopify is that it grows with you. Whether you're just setting up your first online store or you've been running a business for years, Shopify gives you the tools to sell anywhere. Online, in person, across social media, all from one dashboard. It's not just about selling products. It's about building something sustainable. Shopify helps you reach new customers, customize your brand, and track what's working, all without needing to be a tech expert. So if you've been sitting on that idea or side hustle, this is your sign to start. Shopify makes it simple to bring your business to life and to keep it growing. If you're ready to sell, you're ready for Shopify. Turn your big business idea into with Shopify on your side. Sign up for your $1 per month trial and start selling today at shopify.com/murderdiaries. Go to shopify.com/murderdiaries, shopify.com/murderdiaries. Police knew that in his capacity as an informant, JC was involved in the indictment of a man called Dwayne "Butchie" Griffin, whose girlfriend at the time of the murder was Deneen. This man became the first person of interest. 2 officers were sent to Dwayne's house, but his car wasn't in the driveway and he wasn't home. A young girl in the front yard told the officers, "Butchie's not here. We're meeting him at court today." The officers called the courthouse and asked that authorities on that end detain Dwayne once he arrived. Dwayne was taken to the local sheriff's office, and the police were able to speak to him at around 1 p.m. that afternoon. He told them that on July 10th, Deneen picked him up from work at around 9 p.m. Then they picked up Deneen's son, Shane, from Deneen's mother's house and returned home around 10:45 p.m. Deneen then left the house at around 4 a.m. for a babysitting job, but was back home with Dwayne by 7:30 a.m. Dwayne got up around this time, fed the dog, and then went to court for his appearance. He denied hiring someone to kill or attack JC, and said that he hadn't seen JC in more than a month. They'd run into each other at a gas station. However, Dwayne did tell the police that he did hate JC and that his cousin had even offered to, quote, take care of him. But despite Dwayne's ire, he told police that he never wished harm on anyone, no matter how much hate he had for them. Dwayne agreed to take a polygraph test, which he passed. Police had more than their fair share of tips and leads to follow in the wake of JC's murder. First was a woman called Barbara Marlin, who told police she saw Omar Foston running from Wheeling Break and Block as she dropped her son off at the store the morning of the murder. She reported seeing him wearing black boxer shorts, which is different from what Omar was wearing when police interviewed him later at the Foston home. He was wearing blue and yellow shorts and a tank top. A man named Chris Baumer reported seeing an early 1990s black Cadillac in the Foston's driveway around 6 a.m. that morning. He said he saw a black man in the driver's seat of the car and another man standing in the driveway. He actually waved at the car because he thought this man might be one of the Fostons. Chris, who was in his own car at the time, continued to drive. And that's when he noticed the Cadillac following him for a while, before slowing and turning around. On July 13th, just a couple of days after JC's murder, Omar's aunt, Debbie Jones, called the police and told them that a dark green van had been near her house for the last several days. It had been driven by a white woman and a black man. She also said she had been contacted by Dwight McGhee, Omar's cousin and JC's nephew, who lived in California. Dwight told her, "You're next in the box, and you know too much." 10 minutes later, she saw the van, which was followed closely by a black Cadillac, driving slowly down the street outside of her home, honking their horns as they passed by. Debbie explained to the police that there was supposed bad blood within the family. According to Debbie, Omar had ripped off his cousin Dwight and Dwight's brother Richard Boots Foston. The windshield of Dwight's car had been broken the last time he was in town, and he told his family that he knew who had done it and that he was going to, quote, take care of it. The perpetrators of the Omar robbery had asked Pearl about a safe, something that Dwight and Richard had definitely known about. This made her suspicious that they might have had something to do with the attempted robbery, and also because no harm had come to Pearl.
Police also spoke with several employees of the Wheeling Brake and Block Company. Owner Ron Burgess told the police that he saw a black man, presumably Omar, at around 6:45 a.m., wearing only shorts at the front of the business. Ron went on to say that Omar seemed winded from running as he spoke of being robbed and was asking him to call the police. Omar stayed at the business until police cruisers arrived, at which point Ron witnessed him walking home.
A man named Gregory Brody arrived at Brake and Block at around 6:36 a.m. for work and said he saw a black Cavalier car sitting in the driveway at the Foston house. He said there was a black man sitting in the car. At first, Brody thought it was JC, but then realized that JC drove a Cadillac, so it must not have been him. Two other Brake and Block employees named Patrick Shane Wildren and John Scott carpooled to work that morning, and they too noticed a small dark car on the Foston driveway with the black man sitting behind the wheel. They also reported seeing a black Lincoln with 3 black men in it. At one point, the man in the back seat ducked down to hide. Wildren and Scott said he'd been wearing sunglasses. There were many other employees who witnessed Omar that morning, either walking home or at the Brake and Block store as they arrived for work. On July 12th, 2 men gave voluntary statements to the police. They said they'd been hanging out at the house of a girl named Jersey, who told them that her boyfriend, Brandon Creighton, drove a black van that had most likely been involved in that shooting. On July 18th, Omar and Kim were brought in for another round of questioning. And at this interview, Omar's story changed a little. He said that the car he saw in the driveway was a PT Cruiser. He also remembered someone being called buzzers over the radio, and someone else saying something about Richard's money. Omar took a polygraph, but it didn't go smoothly. The results showed deception, so he was questioned further, while Kim helped create a composite sketch with her description of the assailants. Omar and Kim returned to the police station on July 29th to view photos of potential suspects. Omar was able to ID one of the men in the photos as one of the assailants from the morning of the attempted robbery. Both he and Kim also ID'd another man called Daryl Smith. While Kim had no previous knowledge of him, Omar said he knew him from one of his college classes. According to Kim, Daryl was the man with the shotgun. Omar told police that Daryl's girlfriend, Tisha, drove a purple PT Cruiser. In addition to Daryl, Kim was able to identify another attacker with 100% certainty, and another man she thought was there but wasn't completely positive about. Daryl Smith was arrested on July 30th at around 1 p.m. on the charge of murder. He was read his rights and his shoes were taken as evidence. When he was arrested, Daryl was with a woman named Jill Templin. Now, Jill told the police that she was Daryl's friend and that on July 11th, she and Daryl had stayed at the Knights Inn in St. Clairsville, and that she had been with Daryl every day for the last 3 weeks. On the night of July 10th, she said that she and Daryl had been at a bar called Michael's until around 3 a.m., after which they went to another bar called Sundown until it closed at around 3:30. From there, she and Daryl went to Daryl's mother's house where he was living. But Daryl didn't have his key and he didn't want to wake his family. But Jill had a tent in her car, so she and Daryl camped somewhere for the rest of the night, waking at around 8 a.m. She said they were back at Daryl's mom's house no later than 10 a.m. and were there for the rest of the day. She also told them that Dwight McGhee had called her recently, and he said that she better come forward with information she allegedly had on Daryl, or else she should watch her back. She said that Dwight, who lived in California, had been seen back in Ohio recently. On July 31st, police spoke with Dwight McGhee's former employer, Greg Harris. Now, Greg told them that Dwight had frequently made threats towards JC. It was reported that Dwight had driven by JC's house before the murder and made a gun gesture with his hand at JC. On August 6th, detectives spoke with a woman named Nicole Daniels, who they had been told had information about JC's murder. When they questioned her, she said that in December of 2001, she was present at a robbery with a group of men who did a lot of scores together. And she said they always used 2 cars. One of the robbers happened to be Daryl Smith. She said that she believed that Daryl and his group of robber friends were responsible for the home invasion of a man called Sherman Smith. Police spoke to Sherman on August 16th, and he told them that in October of 2001, Daryl Smith and a man named Mike Stovall attacked him and tied him up with shoestring. He was threatened with a knife, and Smith and Stovall robbed him of $500 and 2 coats. He was eventually able to free himself from the shoestring bindings and run away. Sherman also told police of an incident before the robbery when Daryl Smith had fired shots at him with a gun. Police interviewed Dwight McGhee on August 6th, and he told them that he believed that Omar Foston and Richard Foston may have had something to do with JC's murder. According to Dwight, on the day of JC's funeral, all of the McGhee and Foston cousins met up and discussed the murder. The goal was to see if anyone had any connection to the crime, even if it wasn't on purpose. The cousins eventually singled out Richard Foston, who grew angry and had to be removed from the group. Then on August 14th, a dark van with a silver stripe and Ohio plates was involved in a wreck. This van very closely matched the van seen by Omar and others the morning of the murder. The man driving the van was interviewed, his photo was taken, and he took and passed a polygraph exam. Kim Smith's brother-in-law, Justin Beery, was interviewed on October 18th, and he told them that he overheard someone at a bar talking about JC's murder. Beery heard 3 names of those involved: Daryl Smith, Danny Banks, and Brandon Creighton. The 3 men were referred to in code or street names. Daryl was Be Nice, Danny was Dan Bino, and Brandon was Black. Justin said that before leaving the bar, he attempted to shake Brandon Creighton's hand, and Creighton began yelling at him and cussing him out. Threats of violence were made as Justin was walking out of the bar. On November 1st, police met and questioned a man named Raymond Hanley. He claimed to have information about the murder and gave the name of a man who allegedly drove the car used in the crime. He also claimed that Daryl wasn't the person who shot JC. In January of 2004, Daryl, who was by that time serving a 30-year prison sentence for drug charges, was offered a decreased sentence in exchange for information about JC's murder. Daryl spoke to an attorney about the deal, and ultimately, he turned down the offer. Months later that same year, a woman named Raina told police that while hanging out with Nicole Daniels, Daryl Smith, and others one night, she overheard Daryl and an unknown man talking about JC's murder. Daryl allegedly named the driver and said that he, Daryl, would get away with the murder. At some point, either during or before 2004, a grand jury was convened to deliberate on Daryl Smith being brought to trial for the murder of JC McGhee. The charges were ultimately dropped during these proceedings, and no one else was arrested for the crime. It was during this time that police told JC's daughter, Madison, that they can't risk taking Daryl to trial. The lack of evidence would surely result in the case being overturned, and double jeopardy laws would prohibit him from being charged for the same crime again. Madison firmly believes that it was at this point that JC's murder case was finished in their eyes, that it was unsolvable. The police interviewed Omar McGhee again in February of 2005 when he told them that he was ready to share some information that he had previously been afraid to tell them for fear of retaliation. Omar said that a woman named Jennifer Burkle had been seen with Daryl Smith and a man named Tone. Omar then named several men who had allegedly been present during the attacks on the Foston and McGhee homes in 2002. He said that Daryl Smith and another man acted as lookouts that morning. It's important to note that throughout his many interviews, Omar's story has changed frequently. While Madison doesn't believe that Omar was the person who pulled the trigger and killed her father, his changing stories and lies make her believe that he's never told the police everything he knows about what truly went on that morning. Additionally, Madison said that Omar changed clothes before the police arrived on the morning of the murder, which, at least to me, seems strange and highly suspicious.
Later in 2005, Greg Harris, Dwight McGhee's former employer, informed police that he'd been told that the murder of J.C. McGhee was a robbery gone wrong and that it was never intended for J.C. to be hurt that morning.
Madison believes that her father's race has played a role in the investigative efforts of the small Ohio Police Department, who have never really seemed to take the case very seriously. I do think, given the context and the time and location, it's hard to imagine that in 2002 in Belmont County, Ohio, when a drug dealer was shot and killed, that they treated the case the same as they would have for a white man, Madison said. It's hard for me to buy that. I don't think it's all about race, but I just don't think that if my dad looked any differently, you would argue that they weren't treating that case differently. To this day, Madison still believes that there are people in town that know what happened to her father. I think this is the weirdest case of the worst kept secret, she said. I think there's this element of sort of not trusting the police. I also think that the longer it goes, the less likely you are to think that even if the police had new information, what are they going to do with it? They've already not done anything, so why would they care now? Madison further stated, "It's weird that there's nowhere else to turn when you don't trust the police. But if you need help, your option is to bleed out or call 911. Those are your options. And I think a lot of people, proverbially speaking, are just bleeding out because they just don't really trust the police enough to call and get help. And that's sort of what's been happening in this case, I think." When asked what she thinks really happened that morning, Madison said that she believes that her father was targeted and that the attack on Omar, Pearl, and Kim was just a way to get some extra money while delivering the hit on JC. She believes that Omar was used as a way to get JC to open the door. Though it is strange to her that JC didn't have a gun on him that morning when he was killed. She said that to have opened the front door, he would have passed several guns on the way to doing so. She believes Omar was the reason he opened the door that morning. It's the only way he would have done so with his daughter Alyssa still asleep inside his home. Madison believes that the home invasion at the Foston home was a way for the killers to hide the intentionality of JC's murder. She believes her father was targeted because of his involvement as a confidential informant for the police. People were unhappy with him and thought the best way to solve things was by JC being out of the picture in a very permanent way. That's what Madison thinks. So, exactly what does justice for her father look like for Madison? This is what she had to say. "I had to decide in the beginning very early on where my bar would be for some sort of closure and peace. And I think just knowing if I can get to a point where I'm like, all this evidence lines up in my head and all of this makes sense to me, and this is what happened to my dad, whether or not a court of law is going to convict someone, whether or not they're going to go arrest someone or whatever, if I know that this is what happened and I can get this confirmed by the right people and the right witnesses and the right evidence for me, I'm good. I did what I came here to do." In 2023, Madison published the first episode of an investigative podcast about the murder of her father. It's called Ice Cold Case, Investigating the Murder of John Cornelius McGhee. After she learned the truth of how he died, she became curious about what happened to him and finding the truth. It's a very full circle for Madison because she grew up watching Nancy Grace and America's Most Wanted, and she realized that if she wanted answers, she would have to spread the word of her father's murder on her own. "If people don't care about my dad's case because it's not high profile, then I'll make it high profile," she said. And there's power in numbers and there's power in interest. The best way to help Madison is to listen to her podcast and share the story of J.C. McGhee. Again, that podcast is Ice Cold Case, investigating the murder of John Cornelius McGhee.
For more content, make sure to follow us on YouTube and all of our socials at the Murder Diaries Pod. We'll be back Monday for an episode of Unscripted and next Thursday for another episode of our true crime case coverage. Until then,
Stay safe.
bye.